Good morning, everybody. We'll give everybody just a minute or so to finish joining. I like to try to get a good percentage of who signed up versus who's actually showing up. Looks like we're doing pretty good today. So I am going to keep everybody muted until we get to the questions. If you have any questions, then please put them into the questions panel in your GoToWebinar, and we'll get to those at the end. And then we'll either read the questions out loud or we will just unmute you so you can talk yourself. I usually like to do that. So thanks for coming today. So today's webinar is going to be Dynamic CRM Team Development Best Practices. Now, I will admit, first off, this is a matter of personal opinion and conjecture. Best practices that I recommend may not actually be the best practices that you have, and hopefully, if we can get some feedback from the community here, we can come up with some other good things to put into the presentation. So these are some things that I have noticed working with different teams, different customers, different partners, things like that. So I really kind of want to get into what other people are doing. So if you have stuff to share, I would just absolutely love to hear it. So let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Mitch Milam. I'm a dynamic CRM architect. You can reach me at mitch@xrmcoaches.com. My main blog is infinite-x.net, and of course I am on Twitter at Mitch Milam. So feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions about anything that we cover today. We got any suggestions about future things, you can put it on my Teaching Tuesdays Google Moderator site, which will be up through the end of the month. You can get to that from tinyurl.com/Teaching Tuesdays. Probably in the next week or so, I'm going to move that to another hosting thing, so where we can actually record different types of things. So the idea here is, if you have an idea that you would like to see me talk about or like to attend, then leave some feedback, and people can upvote it if they would like, and if they agree or not, or disagree, quite honestly. So love to have good feedback. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be up on my webinar site on my YouTube channel today. So you can always get to that through xrmcoaches.com/webinars. It has the current webinar list as well as the recorded webinars. I've got a slight issue with something, believe it or not, called webinar spam, and it is where something registers fake attendees. I don't know exactly who does that and why to do that, but I've got to clean my database out before I can email everybody. And because I have a package called Complete Dimensions, which automatically imports my attendees from GoToWebinar directly into my Dynamic CRM product, and it's really handy, saves a ton of time. And unfortunately, this since GoToWebinar does not have a CAPTCHA control, there's no way to prevent Autobots from actually filling out stuff. So that's been a huge problem for me in the past like 3 weeks. So as soon as I get that cleaned up, I'll send out some show notes about this and some topics we're talking today, and hopefully we'll have a good recording for that. So let's get started. And my agenda sucks because I forgot to fill it out. I will fix that. So let's talk about team development basics. When it really comes down to it, everything about team development is all about processes. It's just not a technology issue. So we have to have properly defined processes. We need to execute on those processes, and then we need to have constant follow-up and review of the processes to make sure, one, people are using them, and then two, we actually have the right tools and the right processes put in place for people to do their jobs. Okay, this should be pretty simple for everybody, but this is the gist of it. I've got a set of rules that I created a while ago, and number 3 is technology does not fix process issues. So again, this is not a technology problem. Technology can make this better, it can make it worse, but in general, the process is what we have to worry about in this case. So to start off with, let's talk about tooling. So when you start a process like this, and your team can be a team of actually 1, your team can be a team of 2 or more, up to 10, 15, whatever it might be for your organization. So you need to determine the tools that everyone's going to use. Okay? Then we need to make sure that the people have training on those tools and that they're properly implemented and that everybody's using them. Now, this sounds really, really simple, and it will be, at times, the worst thing you'll ever have to deal with. and it will be hard to deal with because some people just don't like the tools that they have to use, so they don't use them. Well, if you have one person not using a tool, that can actually affect everyone in the system, especially with dynamic CRM where you can make changes, shall we say, nilly-willy. So you can actually go into CRM and you can make a customization change and nobody knows you did it, and they did it in production instead of in development, and the next rollout of your solution overwrites what they did, and it caused the problem again because whatever they fixed is no longer there. So having the tooling in place for you to actually have everyone work with is very, very important. The next step is your development environment. Now, the development environment actually has several kind of phases to it. So we have, at a very top level, we have a developer development, a test, and a production cycle. Okay, so we create things in our development environment, we push them over to our test or our QA environment. Assuming everything worked fine, we move it to our production environment. Okay, so that's generally the way that works. Your environment may be fewer systems than this. There are environments that I've worked on, of course, that have one environment. It is production. That's a different kind of problem. So we're going to leave that for a little bit later. If anybody wants to talk about it, we can do that too. Sometimes you have more. Sometimes you may have development 1, development 2, a QA, a staging, and a production. So each organization is going to have a little bit different take on this. Then you need to determine the individual developer configuration. Where will your people be working? Will they have a virtual machine that is your development environment that has a copy of more or less your configuration as far as the CRM goes, so that they're working on a close proximity to production? Are you going to have everyone work off of a centralized development server? Either one of these things can work given the proper procedures and processes you put in place. Sometimes the developer really truly needs to have their own environment, such as developing plugins. Plugins really need to be developed in isolation in most cases, strictly because when you start debugging plugins, you can actually bring the server to a screeching halt when you attach the debugger. And nobody likes that. So having an individual developer configuration that makes sense for the job that the developer does is very, very important. Okay, and again, there are things that you can do for your developers that are specific to your company, whereas other people have a different method of work, and they're both correct given the circumstances. Okay? Then we have to worry about how are we going to move our code and our customizations and everything else that makes up a solution. And when I say solution, I'm not talking about the dynamic CRM solution package. I'm talking about here is our thing we made, and that is a solution, and we need to move that from our dev environment to our test to our production. How are we doing that? Okay, so you can create tools and processes for moving that. A tool that is quite common these days is PowerShell. You can do some frighteningly cool things with PowerShell. There are several vendors that have packages to help you move your information from one part of CRM to the other. There's some free things out there. I've got a package kind of on the back burner that I've been working on for a year and a half or so that I'm still trying to decide if I'm actually going to sell or not. But it is designed to help people move things from both a development and administration thing area into how we're going to manage the production lifecycle. Okay, so these things are all very important because the idea here is you want to automate as much as you can so that it happens consistently and it happens repeatability. Your repeatability is high. That's what we're after. So we want it to be able to be repeated, and it needs to be able to happen every single time. Okay. The job functions of a developer are going to be all over the place. So generally you have people who can write plugins, people who do JavaScript, people who do custom pages, either ASP.NET if you're on-premise, or HTML/JavaScript if you're anywhere else, or all the above. You have people who can do customization, so they're good at defining schema, modifying forms, creating workflows, all of these things. How you split these things up amongst your development team is really going to kind of guide how you do some of your actual pushing out of data and your changes to the system. Okay, plugins are really easy to isolate, like I said, because you can take a package. The plugin registration tool allows you to insert the plugin directly into the CRM environment. Then from there you can push it into a solution that you move along. JavaScript is a little bit more complicated because it's inside the database and it's done through the user interface. And then the customizations. The way that I like to do this is all data or all metadata is always created in only one place. Okay, so if we have a centralized development server they're working on, we only create new things on that machine, and that's it. Okay, and the reason is due to the way that some of the internals of CRM work. There's a thing called an object type code it's still used. It starts for custom entities. It starts at 10,000 going up. The standard out of the box entities are below 10,000. For instance, account is a 1, contact is a 2, 3 is a lead, or 3 is an opportunity, 4 is a lead. Things like that. So they're occasionally needed, and what happens is if you start creating custom entities in different environments, you can run into an object collision sometimes between these codes. And so it's always just a really not a best practice, it's a great practice to always try and do your schema development only on one organization on a server. Then you can move that to other places. So like if you have a developer installation per developer, so they have a VM with CRM and SQL loaded, and you need to push the customizations out to them, you can do so pretty easily. But I always like to have one place where we do this. Source control. Okay, now when people think of source control, most of the time they're thinking about code. Okay, it doesn't have to be code, quite honestly. But you do need to use source control of some type. So if you have Visual Studio and you have MSDN, you may have Visual Studio, or sorry, Team Foundation Services, or TFS. If you have kind of actually a small development team below 5 people, you can actually get Visual Studio Online, which includes a free version of TFS. So it's in the cloud, it's secured, it's only for you, and that's a great thing if you don't have time or you don't have the resources to set up your own TFS server. Git is also a possibility. You can have a local Git repository, or you can have a private storage on GitHub, for instance. Regardless of which one of these tools you use, and these are only 2 of them, there are many different source control systems out there. The idea is you need to use something. Strictly because sooner or later somebody's going to make a mistake and you're going to have to roll back your changes, and you need to have a place to roll back to. Without source control, the probability of you having that is extremely, extremely low. Okay? So that's the first thing. Get a source control product, learn how to use it, make sure your team knows how to use it, and then create processes around how you as a team are going to use source control along with your development effort. Okay? And the second bullet is something that I've actually kind of been through a couple of times. Make sure that whatever system you're using has an integrated tracking or issue tracking thing, strictly because being able to tie a bug to a piece of code is very valuable, because one, it shows what you're doing. So when your management comes to you and it's like, well, you got all these developers and you're back there, smoking cigarettes and drinking Coke all day. What are you doing? We say, okay, we fixed these bugs this week. And you can just pull a report, push it to them in Excel, instant email. Here's what we did this week. If you don't have that, it makes it more cumbersome for the developer. And as you know, myself included, all developers are lazy. The best developers are the laziest. Bill Gates actually said that one time, because they find the most efficient way to do things. Okay, so the less friction you put in between your developers and how you have to do things as a company, the better off everything's going to be. And then finally, we have to have processes. Again, it all goes back to process to guide the developers to how to use the tools. For instance, don't check in code that will not compile. I cannot tell you how many times I've worked places and they do that. Then they check that code in, they didn't compile it first, it won't compile, and now nobody's code will compile because they've all pulled the latest version down, and now somebody has to go and figure out why it won't compile and fix the issue. Okay, so you've got code, things like that. You've got things like these days, NuGet is very popular for getting modules installed into a system. NuGet, for those of you who are older and remember the day of DLL hell, NuGet is the new DLL hell. Having the proper version of NuGet packages installed on your system can be a nightmare. I've got one project, and if I don't keep up with it on a weekly basis, then sometimes it's actually easier for me to delete the directory and pull everything down from scratch, because it's easier than trying to actually figure out what happened and why it won't work. So I just literally start over occasionally. So that's the joy of some of these things. But the main idea here is, with source control, get one, learn how to use it, make sure everybody uses it, and put processes in place. So the build process can be automated to a lesser or greater extent. It really and truly depends on how you do things. It depends on the size of your team, and then also what kind of solution you're working with. So if you're working with plugins, that's a .NET thing. We can compile those locally. We can, after we're done, we take the DLL, we can push it somewhere, get it into CRM, get it tested, etc. Anything like that can be fairly automated. When you get into the world of CRM that is not .NET, so that would be starting with JavaScript is the next one in line. Automating the build process there, what does that mean? Does that mean I need to take it from source control and insert it into our development server as in our web resources, get into a solution, and then export that? If you back down to the customization level, it's not easily done at this point in time, but I think it's coming. You can kind of see some of these things, but having the ability to have your customizations, the XML of the customizations inside your source control, to where you can actually track the changes to the XML as part of your process, it can be very valuable. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, when you export it out a solution, it's a zip file. Inside that zip file, it's a customization.xml file. Inside that XML is everything that needs to be known about an entity to make it work. So that is the physical schema of it, anything that's attached to it, the things that make it go, like the fields, the attributes, the forms, the views, things like that, things that are related to it. All of that can be extracted out and kept inside of source control, because it is source. XML is a type of source. It may not be JavaScript or C#, but it's still type of source. So by putting that type of thing into your source control, you can actually use that to do comparisons to see, okay, we have a really weird thing that happened and now we can't figure it out. So you can actually export the solution out, unzip it, compare the customization XML file to the one in your source control system, and find out where the anomaly is. That's very easily done. And unfortunately, it happens probably more than it should. Okay, so some of these things can be fully automated. So like I said, the any kind of .NET code can be automated, where you can build it and then push it to where it needs to be actually utilized with either PowerShell or some of the automated build scripts that come with the tools that you might use. Then partially automated processes are just, some things have to be done by hand, but other things can be done by the system. That's the idea there. So unit testing. So I really love unit testing for a lot of things. My JavaScript conversion tool that converts from Serum 4.0 object model to the Serum 2011 and above object model is 100% reliant on unit tests. There are probably 600 or so tests that I wrote, because when I convert stuff from one thing to the other, I always have to rerun my test to make sure I didn't break something that was kind of a side effect of the new conversion technique that I used. So that product could not absolutely exist without unit testing. Could not happen. When you get into a standard corporate environment, you kind of will run into situations where some people love unit tests, some people hate unit tests. Some people consider unit tests to be extra work that I have to do. I have to write more code to do this stuff. That's not what it's about. It's about being able to test your changes. So if you have a set of code and you design your code for testing, this is the most important thing. If you design your code to be tested, you can create unit tests that are producing valid test results that show you, yes, the code is working, or no, it's not working in this case. And then anytime you make a change, you can rerun your tests to see if your change broke anything. That's what they're there for. And this is a huge educational wall for people to kind of overcome. A lot of people, I know people who are excellent developers, have never written a unit test in their entire life because they just have never needed to, because no one in their organization does that. And they can go from organization to organization and nobody does it. I've gone and written unit tests for my own personal work in a project at a customer, and nobody but me uses them. And then when I leave, they throw them away. That's what happens. But the idea is you create your code. So, for instance, if you take a plugin, many people put the code for a plugin into the execute method because that's what it does. Execute gets run, it executes whatever's inside of that, and then it keeps going. If you take it one step back and pull all the kind of the guts of the plugin and put it into another class or classes that can be called independently, that you can actually pass data into, that allows you to actually test the results of the code doing things. And then you just make function calls or method calls from your execute method into the code, and there's no difference. It still functions the same way, and it actually gives you a cleaner code base. Because there's nothing worse than seeing an execute method that's 1,000 lines long because they stuck everything in there. So it makes it easier to read, easier to maintain, and of course easier to test. Okay, and there's a wide variety of these things. There's tools that you can get to help you test your plugins. There's tools you can help you get to test your JavaScript even. So whatever tools you use, you need to make sure that you kind of standardize on one. Make sure the developers are educated as to why they're doing it. Again, it's not just more work. It's actually work that has a value to it. And once they kind of understand the value, then it's not as hard to convince them. But the main thing is you don't need to be writing tests to just write tests. You need to be writing tests that actually prove out the system. That's the idea. And the final thing, and I may get a lot of pushback on this, but I don't use mocks, which is a way to simulate how something should function with my CRM testing. And the reason I don't do so is because so many of the things that we work on are dependent on other either internal actions or actions of our own code, say plugins, that removing the actual system from the equation can actually produce different results. So when I do unit testing, I've got a framework that I got from a guy named Eric Poole, who used to be at Avanade, and I use his framework that I modified, and then I actually connect to CRM, and then I exercise the plugin, and it actually does real work. And I do that strictly because the number of variables that I can ensure that I'm actually hitting, which is, again, other plugins, either internal or custom or workflows or whatever it might be, I make sure that those things are exercised too, because those things could be out of my control and they could act differently in a testing situation versus a real life situation. So I don't like to use the mocking frameworks to actually test out some things because I really want the thing to happen. So if it says go create this record, I want to create that record. Okay. If you've ever looked at the code that's in the CRM SDK, you'll notice it has a very, very specific format. It does a bit of creation, so it goes and creates some records. Then it will do whatever the exercise is that the sample is proving out, and then it will go and remove the whatever it created in step one. The idea behind that is they unit test all of their samples. So they create the test data, they exercise the test data, and they remove the test data. And then that way they start over every single time. I've actually run into situations where at a customer, I actually had to work on live data because the data was it was a date-based calculation, and there was no physical way for me to simulate that calculation. I literally had to use live data, and that means that at points in time, the unit test would start failing because we had moved past a date, and there was no way around it. I just couldn't simulate that to the point where the code actually worked correctly, and I couldn't in order for me to verify the results. So unit tests can be a lot of work sometimes, but I really and truly think that if you could put these things into place, it really and truly makes you a better developer, and it makes the work that you produce much stronger. Okay. So hang on one second. Okay. So there's a terminology out there, if you've never heard it, called continuous integration. So this is a technique to where you have a build server. So it's a server that is used to build your project. So when you check things in, it can do things like run unit tests against the code. It can actually build the code itself. It can deploy the code to a thing, and that way you can always be checking your work through the entire life cycle of the development process. Not everybody uses this. It's a bit of work to set up. Some situations don't lend well to continuous integration, especially with dynamic CRM, but other parts are perfectly well suited for continuous integration. So if you are in a situation where you want a higher level of consistency with your development efforts that can test things and do things automatically so the developer doesn't have to do them, you need to investigate the continuous integration. So hopefully some people have something to say about this at the end. I'd love to hear feedback on it. Okay, usability testing. Rule number one when working with any type of developer is just because the developer tested the code does not mean it worked. Okay? Strictly because developers should not be testing their own code because they know how it works or how it should work. So they test how it should work. They don't test how it shouldn't work. That's what QA resources are for. So if you have an organization of any size and you have multiple developers, I would strongly suggest that you have some type of QA resource. So QA means quality of assistance, if you didn't know. So having someone who can actually do testing either on a full-time or a part-time basis is excellent. Okay. The second thing you need to do is have real users do real testing. Nothing beats that. And when I say real users, I mean this needs to be part of their job. It's like, okay, we're going to this phase. Okay, here's our development process. We're doing say a 2 or 3 week sprint. And week 2, we finish up our internal testing. And then on week 3, we're doing QA, and we want the QA resources and the users testing at the same time. So this is generally something that I would really recommend, if at all possible, strictly because even though QA may know the system really well, possibly even as well as developers, having a real user sit down and test something can never be beaten. Strictly because they use it all the time. They can spot things that maybe the QA people don't know because they don't really use it. Testing and using is a totally different thing, if you guys never figured that out. So being able to test things from a genuine user perspective is invaluable, in my opinion. Okay. The kind of final phase of the whole development lifecycle is deployment to production. So the questions you have to ask yourself is, who's going to be doing it? When are we doing it? What are we doing? And how often are we doing it? So I mentioned sprint a few minutes ago. So that's kind of an agile development practice. And all that means is we're going to take a period of time. It could be a week. It could be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is. And we're going to decide what we're going to develop or fix or whatever it might be. And then we're going to establish a timeline. We're going to work on those things. We're going to fix or develop new things. We're going to test those things out. And then finally, at the end of that sprint, we're actually going to deploy our changes into production. It's what they call iterative development. So who does that is going to be very important. A lot of times, depending on the size of your organization, developers don't touch production. So they prepare everything. They have it tested out either in an automated, semi-automated, or manual process. They give it to the person who will be deploying it into production, and then they follow the script that was given to them by the developers or the QA people, depending on how you set it up. When is, again, a matter of configuration of the organization. Do you do it on the weekend? Do you do it on Thursday night? Please don't do it in the middle of the day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I've seen people do stupid stuff like that, and that's just not a good way to keep a job. What are you going to deploy? So, are we deploying a hot fix? Okay, we have to have a process for that. So we're working in the middle of the sprint, and all of a sudden we find a show-stopping bug in production. We need to break that bug out into its own thing so we can fix it and get it deployed as soon as possible. And it could be, believe it or not, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, if you have to. And then finally, how often? How often should you cycle your development? That is another thing you have to watch out for. Like I said, 1 week, a 2 week, a 3 week, a 4 week sprint, 2 months, whatever it might be. I'm not a fan of what they call waterfall development. That's where you spend months gathering requirements, months doing development, months doing testing, and then 2 years later you deploy a solution that nobody wants because their business has moved on. So I like the iterative approach. That way we are always developing, we're always pushing things out, we're always getting feedback from users, and we're always improving. That's the idea. Okay, so again, how often you want to do that is going to be 100% determined by your company and your processes. So I like short sprints of, say, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, strictly because you don't bite off more than you can chew. You can get things in front of the user quicker. You can find problems quicker, and hopefully you can add value quicker. That's the main thing. Okay, so again, this is what I came up with. So if anybody has anything that they want to contribute, now would be when you would do it. The last person to contribute gets a puppy. Anybody? Sean Renee, I'll unmute your mic. Okay, can you talk? Sean? Okay, John, I'll come back to you. John Ross, you got something to say?
Hey, yeah, I do. Do you have any blogs or articles on the development of a plugin and then writing it for unit testing?
That's a great question. I know Mark Swigert here is on the line. He's a Microsoft guy. He has some stuff. I'll put that in the show notes. I've been meaning to come up with some stuff like that. It's um, I have a knowledge sorry, it's a newsletter system I call Knowledge Bits, and I'm kind of in the middle of redoing my plugins, but that's actually one of the things that I talk about in that. And Knowledge Bits is basically, like I said, it's a kind of a newsletter system. Well, you sign up for whatever channel you want, and I've got like JavaScript and administration and training, things like that, and then it will deliver you one email a day, just some tips and tricks that I come up with. So every time I come up with a new one, I'll try to add to it. So that it's kind of in that. But the main thing, like I said, is if you can just separate out your code into another module, another class, so you can actually instantiate that on its own, and then pass in
Hmm.
whatever stuff you need to it. Like what I do, depending on the size of it. Like a lot of it, if you see some of my code, I have a class called utility, and I just shove everything into it if it's a small thing. So it's a lot of times it's actually static methods. So it's like, verify phone number or verify email address or whatever it might be, or retrieve contact, for instance. Whatever it is that you can actually separate out, execute that thing, get something back, and then verify, is that what I asked for? Anything at all like that, and be able to cycle through that. And then inside the execute method itself, it's just a call to whatever. So, some of my plugins, you look at them and, they're 4 inches tall because it's just nothing in them besides method calls. So a little bit of logic to make sure, am I in the right place? Did the right thing happen? The right message? Things like that. So if I did that stuff, can I get out of that, a good testing thing?
So, do you ever have to find any use in writing, um, replacing the scenario of the payload that goes in for the message, like the update? So, kind of emulating that versus.
Oh yeah. So
I think I've seen some articles on that, how to maybe.
yeah. So I've got that framework up on my site. I'll send you a link to it. But basically, what you do is when you're unit testing, you prepare an entity, because 99% of the time what you're passing into the system is an entity. So you create the entity or retrieve the entity. So it's just a record, and then you pass that into the plugin, just like the user would have done something. So you do that, and then what happens out of that is you just operate on that system. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, very good. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Jean Rene, are you on now? Okay, still not working. Okay, we'll try to fix that, and I'll come back to you. Okay, got some few things here. Kevin Dowler, have you seen successfully implementations of the XRM CI framework, and any useful sites you could point to? So what Kevin's talking about is one of the frameworks I've mentioned, and I'll put that in my show notes as well. It's a framework. I cannot remember who did it, but it's a way of creating testable code. So it looks really good. I haven't actually used it myself, but it looks really good. So I'll put that in the notes. And let's see what he say. Plugin registration tool. You can isolate plugin testing and debugging, as it does not run on the server and does not interrupt the team. You can use the plugin registration tool for testing. I am not at all a huge fan of that. I think it's too hard to set up. It's too much work. And quite honestly, I would rather have live code. I mean, that's a 100% personal opinion. Your mileage may vary, but what he's talking about is the plugin registration tool has a facility built in where you can record the execution of a plugin and then replay that recording back, and then attach Visual Studio to the plugin registration tool. And then when it executes, you can actually step through your code just like it was live. It does work. I know people use it all the time. I personally would rather debug stuff live. That's just me. Let's see. So how about the JN asked, how about the CRM application lifecycle tools like ADX Studio or the CRM Solution Manager? So ADX Studio has an ALM toolkit. ALM stands for Application Lifecycle Management. And the cool thing about that is, again, it's a bunch of PowerShell stuff. It can connect to CRM. It can move solutions around. It can back up data. It can transfer data, things like that. And what it's used for is to basically automate the process of deploying solutions from one place to the other. So it's really good at that. The CRM Solution Manager is another tool that I really like. I use that in several places. And what that tool does is allow you to do all the work within Visual Studio and then publish from Visual Studio. So you can pull things out of CRM, like plugins, web resources, things like that. When you're done, you can actually deploy them back into CRM without having to go through the plugin registration tool. Very, very handy. I haven't used it actually for plugins. All the work that I did with it previously was, personally anyway, was using web resources, and Steve, the guy who wrote it, has added a bunch of features to it that I haven't had time to try out, but it's got really good things like IntelliSense, and it generates code for you to use for that, and it's just a pretty cool tool. It's not that expensive per developer, and something really good to have. I'll include that in the show notes as well. So Raj asked about version controlling a CRM solution TFS. So what I've done in the past, and part of the PowerShell thing I was working on, is we created a thing where it would automatically increment the build number of the solution, and then we would export the solution out as both managed and unmanaged. And if you've never worked with solutions, or even if you do, always, always, always export both a managed and an unmanaged version of your solution at the same time, or one after the other, doesn't matter. So export a managed, export an unmanaged, have the same version, and then move those into TFS. So you can do that all with a PowerShell script. Okay, and that way you have the full solution. It's going to take a bunch of space, but that's fine. Ross want to ask about unit testing for JavaScript. I personally haven't done a lot. There's a Q unit a lot of people use, is what most people use for JavaScript testing. And Yaniv asked about how do you debug MS Serum Online plugins. The only way that you can debug Serum Online plugin, since you cannot connect to any server, of course, is you have to use the plugin replay feature built into the plugin registration tool. That's the only way that can happen. Most of the time, I try to have some kind of development environment that is extremely close, if not exact, to Serum Online. That's getting harder to do with the separation of the versions. But if you can have a local copy of at least the customization, the database and stuff like that, and then that way you can prove out your stuff on a virtual machine locally, and then deploy the plugin to production inside Serum Online. So not an ideal scenario, but it does work. Okay. Kevin asked how does Serum Online affect the Serum Solution Manager or ADX Studio or CI framework? The CI framework I'm not positive about. I think ADX Studio's ALM Toolkit will work with Serum Online, but I haven't used it. Solution Manager, it will work with Online because it basically just connects directly and pulls things off. Okay. Those are good questions here. So like I said, we've got a lot of tools that we didn't have, even 2 years ago. There's a developer toolkit that's part of the SDK that is, I don't know what the state of it is. They're way behind on stuff. So theoretically they have an update coming, but who knows? I personally don't like the way that they organize some of the stuff. So I don't ever use that. I have my own way of doing things. I know Jason Latimer, one of the other MVPs, is creating some stuff to do, simple connections for web resources and things like that. That'll be a Visual Studio plugin, and it'll probably be free if I'm not mistaken. So that's an option there. But anytime you get into plugins and stuff, especially with online, it's always just a little bit more work than on premise, strictly because again, you don't have access to the resources. Anything else? Okay. So, any other questions? Any other comments, feedback that we want to add to this this webinar today? No. You sure? Last call. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you guys stopping by today, and if anything pops up, then please again let me know. Like I said, I'll have the recording up on YouTube by the end of the day, and probably tomorrow I'll try to get you guys a list of all the stuff that we talked about today. So yeah, so like I said, I'll try to include links to all the products we talked about and some different other things out there. Like I said, the tools out there today are really, really cool, and it's really really good to see the community responding like they are. A lot of the tools that we have out there are actually community-driven tools, so that's always great to see. Okay, well, everybody, again, I really appreciate it. Stay tuned for upcoming webinars. Go out to my XRM Coaches/webinars and sign up. And like I said, this afternoon the recording will be there. So if you don't mind, tweet out there saying, hey, this was good for me, then I'd appreciate that. Thanks a lot, people. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.